It started like a routine morning, tools on the ground, engines half open, coffee still warm, and then the sky began to hum, not loudly at first, just a distant vibration, easy to ignore, easy to misread, until someone looked up and realized those weren't friendly aircraft. They were incoming, 12 of them, Japanese bombers, flying low, fast, and deliberate, and the men on the ground. They weren't soldiers, not really. They were mechanics, oil-stained, sleep-deprived, halfway through another long shift. They weren't supposed to fight, but within minutes they would. Because when the bombs started falling, there was no one else. This wasn't a famous frontline battle. It wasn't a grand naval clash or a carefully planned offensive. It was something messier, faster, more human, a moment where the system failed and ordinary people had to improvise. The setting matters here. This happened during the chaos that followed attack on Pearl Harbor. Not just the attack itself, but the ripple effect across the Pacific. American bases suddenly found themselves exposed. Communications were broken, command structures were confused, and nobody knew where the next strike would land. One of those places was Hickam Field, a major airbase packed with aircraft, packed with fuel, packed with people who were not expecting a fight that morning. The logic of the time was simple. Airbases like Hickam were staging grounds, maintenance hubs, launch points. They weren't designed to defend themselves in a sudden, close-range attack. That's the first uncomfortable truth. The system assumed warning time, radar detection, communication chains, orders flowing down, fighters scrambling up. But that's not what happened. Instead, the warning came in the form of explosions, bombs hitting runways, hangars igniting, aircraft burning before they could even take off. And in that moment, all the theory collapsed into something much more basic: survive. The second uncomfortable truth is about roles. In military planning, roles are clean. Pilots fly, gunners shoot, mechanics fix things. But reality doesn't care about roles. When the attack began, many of the trained combat personnel weren't in position. Some were off duty, some were caught completely off guard, others were simply too far away to respond in time. So the closest people to the fight became the fighters, mechanics, crew chiefs, ground staff, men who understood machines better than weapons. And yet, when the first bombs hit, they didn't run. Or rather, some did at first, which is human, which is expected. But then something shifted. Because once the initial shock passed, the situation became brutally clear. If no one resisted, the base would be completely destroyed. So they grabbed whatever they could find, rifles from storage, sidearms from lockers, even mounted guns that weren't meant to be used without proper crews, and they started firing back. Think about the absurdity of that for a second. 12 bombers in the sky, trained crews, coordinated attack patterns designed for destruction. And on the ground, scattered groups of mechanics improvising a defense in real time. No command structure, no coordinated plan, just fragments of resistance. And yet it mattered, because war at its core often comes down to timing and disruption. Those mechanics didn't need to win. They just needed to interfere, to break the rhythm of the attack, to force the bombers to adjust, to make it harder. And that's exactly what happened. Some of them managed to reach anti-aircraft positions. Others fired from the ground, forcing pilots to fly higher, faster, less accurately. Every second of disruption reduced the effectiveness of the attack. This is the part people often miss in theory. 12 bombers against an unprepared base should be devastating, clean, efficient, but reality is noisy. Resistance, even untrained, improvised resistance creates friction, and friction changes outcomes. Planes that might have made perfect bombing runs instead dropped payloads early. Pilots who expected no opposition suddenly had to dodge incoming fire. The attack became less precise, less controlled, less successful than it could have been. Now zoom out a little. Because this isn't just a story about bravery. It's a story about systems breaking under pressure. Military systems rely on assumptions that warnings will arrive on time, that personnel will be where they're supposed to be, that roles will be followed. But when those assumptions fail, the system doesn't just degrade, it transforms. It becomes something else, something improvised, and sometimes that improvisation is the only thing that prevents total collapse. Back on the ground at Hickam Field, the situation was still chaotic. Fires spreading, aircraft destroyed before they ever left the runway. Casualties mounting, but the base didn't fall into complete silence. There was still resistance, still movement, still people fighting back, even without orders. And that matters more than it sounds, because in warfare, perception is everything. If an attacker believes a target is completely neutralized, they behave differently, more confidently, more aggressively. But if there's resistance, any resistance, it introduces doubt, and doubt slows things down. It forces caution. It changes decisions. In this case, those small pockets of resistance helped prevent the attack from becoming even more destructive, not by overpowering the enemy, but by complicating the situation. There's also a quieter layer to this story, one that doesn't get as much attention. These mechanics weren't trained for combat, but they weren't unprepared. Humans either. They understood systems. They understood pressure. They understood how things fail, and in a strange way, that mindset translates. Because when something breaks, whether it's an engine or a situation, the first instinct is not panic, it's diagnosis. What's happening? What can I use? What can I fix? Even if the fix is just slowing down the damage, that's what they did. Not perfectly, not heroically in the cinematic sense, but effectively enough. And effectiveness, in moments like this, is everything. Now here's where the math gets uncomfortable, because for every story like this where improvisation works, there are many where it doesn't, where the system fails and no one can adapt fast enough, where bases are overrun, where damage becomes catastrophic. So the real question isn't, were these mechanics brave? They were. The real question is, why were they in that position at all? Why did the system depend, even indirectly, on untrained personnel stepping into combat roles? The answer is a mix of overconfidence and underestimation. Before attack on Pearl Harbor, many American installations didn't fully expect a direct, immediate strike on home bases in the Pacific. There were warnings, signals, intelligence fragments, but they didn't translate into readiness. And when the attack came, it exposed those gaps instantly. Hickam Field became one of many places where those gaps turned into real consequences. Burning aircraft, lost lives, and a sudden, brutal lesson in vulnerability, but also unexpected resistance, which brings us back to the mechanics. Because what they did wasn't just reactive, it was symbolic. It showed that even when a system fails, individuals can still influence outcomes, not control them, not reverse them completely, but influence them. And sometimes that's enough to change the trajectory. There's an irony here. Military systems are designed to remove unpredictability, to create structure, to define roles. But the moments that matter most often come from breaking that structure. From people doing things they weren't assigned to do, from decisions made without permission, from action taken in the absence of orders. That's messy, that's inefficient, and sometimes that's exactly what works. If you look at modern military planning, this lesson hasn't been forgotten, but it hasn't been fully solved either. Redundancy is built in. Cross-training is emphasized. Decentralized command structures are more common. But the fundamental problem remains. No system can predict every failure. No plan survives first contact exactly as written. And when things go wrong, someone somewhere has to improvise. The story of those mechanics at Hickam Field is a snapshot of that reality. A moment where the gap between plan and reality was filled not by strategy, but by people. People who picked up rifles they weren't supposed to use, who fired at aircraft they weren't trained to engage, who turned a maintenance yard into a defensive position, not because they were told to, but because there was no alternative. And that leaves us with a final, uncomfortable question. If a system ultimately depends on individuals breaking their roles to save it, was the system ever complete to begin with? Or is that the hidden mechanism? That beneath every structured plan, there's an unspoken expectation that when everything goes wrong, someone will step outside the system and hold the line anyway.